When the night stopped being a safe haven, how U.S. Navy radar night fighters took away Japan's last advantage in the air and changed the rules of war in the Pacific. At the beginning of World War II, the night sky remained almost untouched by military aviation. Aircraft of that era were unable to conduct combat operations in the dark. Pilots relied solely on visual navigation, and the lack of night vision devices or reliable instruments made flying in low visibility extremely dangerous. This problem became especially acute in the Pacific theater after the United States entered the war. As early as 1942, during the height of the Solomon Islands campaign, American bases and naval forces were regularly subjected to night raids by Japanese aircraft. The effectiveness of these attacks lay less in the damage they caused and more in their psychological impact. Lone planes, most often G-4M Betty bombers, would fly over Allied positions, drop a few bombs, or simply patrol overhead, disturbing a troop's rest. These raids earned the nickname Washing Machine Charlie from the Americans, referring to the role of the engines and their constant harassing presence. Despite the limited physical damage, such missions disrupted sleep, unsettled troops, and created a sense of constant threat. While the Japanese used the night as a protective shield from American fighter aviation, the U.S. Navy desperately needed means of detecting and intersecting targets in the dark. The turning point came from British experience. As early as 1940, the Royal Air Force began equipping fighters with early airborne radar systems to counter German night bombers. These developments proved effective. Even without visual contact, a pilot could use radar to close in on a target and destroy it. The U.S. Navy took an interest in British technologies and in 1941 sent Major Frank Schwabel of the Marine Corps to England to study the organization of night fighter units. He returned with detailed reports stressing that effective night aviation required the coordinated operation of three components: onboard radar, ground-controlled interception, or GCI, and specially trained air crews. Based on this, the U.S. began rapidly adapting British solutions. The SCR-540 system, an analog of the AR Mark IV, was licensed for installation on aircraft, along with the SCR-527 ground radar for intercept coordination. However, development was slow. The military leadership was cautious about investing in night fighters, and production lines were already strained by demands from daytime aviation. Still, by mid-1942, the Navy approved the formation of the first night fighter units, including Marine Squadron VMFN 531. The initial technical choice fell on the twin-engine patrol bomber PV-1 Ventura, capable of carrying the heavy radar system and a crew of 3: pilot, radar operator, and gunner. However, the Ventura was relatively slow and lacked agility, limiting its potential as an interceptor. Parallel experiments began with single-seat fighters. The first to be modified was the Vought F4U Corsair in the F4U2 variant, equipped with a compact AN/APS-4 radar system. This was a significant technological breakthrough. For the first time, a single-seat carrier-based fighter was equipped with a functioning airborne radar system.
One of the first Navy combat units to use such aircraft was VF-97, a night fighter squadron based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. They began conducting night patrols in mid-1943, working alongside Army P-70s and other early night platforms. At first, effectiveness was low, the pilots lacked experience, and the radar systems were prone to failure. But by autumn 1943, the first victories were achieved. In October, pilot Lieutenant Hugh O'Neill shot down a Japanese bomber at night using radar, marking a key milestone, the first successful nighttime radar-guided aerial intercept in the history of the U.S. Navy. By the end of 1943, the U.S. had developed a working model of night fighter aviation. It included adapted aircraft, F-4-2, PV-1, a first wave of trained crews, and a growing network of ground radar stations. These components laid the foundation for the coming radar offensive. The the transfer of nighttime air superiority from the Japanese to the Americans, turning darkness from an enemy's advantage into a liability. The successes of 1943 proved that properly equipped and trained units could effectively combat airborne threats even in complete darkness. A new era in aerial warfare had begun, an era of 24-hour control, where radar became as essential as weaponry. The emergence of the first American radar-equipped night fighters in 1943 presented the U.S. Navy with a new challenge: how to use these machines effectively in combat, especially in the absence of an established doctrine for night operations. Without much prior experience, the Americans began cautiously, relying heavily on improvisation. One of the first tactics tested aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise involved nighttime patrols consisting of a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber equipped with radar, accompanied by a pair of F-6F Hellcat fighters for cover. The Avenger's role was to detect targets, typically lone Japanese bombers or reconnaissance planes, after which the fighters would be guided in to attack. However, this tactic proved unstable. The heavy torpedo bomber was slow and lacked maneuverability, and a single radar-equipped platform did not provide sufficient coverage. Gradually, during the campaigns in the Solomons and New Guinea, a layered system of defense and radar-guided night patrols began to take shape. At the core of this new strategy was the practice of maintaining a flight of fighters in the air from dusk through the early morning hours, each equipped with its own onboard radar. The most common configuration was a two-plane team, one acting as the hunter, or lead, the other as a wingman to provide cover in case of technical failure or sudden enemy attack. This method proved optimal. If one pilot lost contact or failed to engage the target, the other could continue the mission. Radio coordination between the pilots and ground-based controllers ensured constant communication. A key component of this new strategy was the use of radar picket ships, destroyers and escort carriers outfitted with long-range radar. These ships would be positioned 50 to 100 kilometers ahead of the main fleet, in the most likely direction of enemy approach. Their mission was to detect incoming Japanese aircraft early, particularly low-flying groups using darkness for cover. Once identified, the information was relayed either to Fleet Command or directly to night patrols already airborne, enabling timely interception. The Navy effectively created an aerial screen that made it extremely difficult for enemy planes to approach undetected.
Coordination with anti-aircraft artillery was also crucial. Since visual identification was nearly impossible at night, there was a high risk of friendly fire. To mitigate this, a strict protocol was implemented. When an enemy aircraft was spotted, searchlights would track the target while AA guns temporarily ceased fire to allow night fighters to engage. Once the fighters withdrew or the target was destroyed, the gunners resumed fire. This required high precision from pilots in both navigation and discipline. Any deviation from the flight path could be misread as hostile by ground units. Over time, ground-controlled interception, or GCI tactics, became standard. Interception officers at GCI stations would pick up enemy aircraft on radar and guide the fighter pilot using azimuth, range, altitude, and lead angle data. The pilot's task was to follow these vectors until the target appeared on his own radar screen. Then came the final approach, ideally to within 300 to 500 meters behind the enemy, requiring minimal maneuvering to avoid losing the radar lock. To support this approach, the U.S. Navy developed unified training programs. Night patrol simulations, blind intercepts using vectoring, flights without visual reference points, and radar-assisted firing exercises. Training focused not just on pilots, but also on GCI officers and radar operators. Every participant, from destroyer radio operators to aircraft gunners, became part of a complex system. That level of integration required time and discipline, but yielded tangible results. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had formalized a multi-layered concept of night defense for both fleets and shore bases, known as the Big Blue Blanket. This strategy involved complete coverage of a 60-mile radius around fleet formations using continuous patrols and overlapping radar detection. Night fighter squadrons were based not only ashore but also aboard large carriers, which were deliberately reinforced with radar-equipped aircraft. The standard became the F-6H-5N Hellcat, fitted with radar and upgraded armament. Commanders increased the number of fighter sections in task groups, treating night threats as a constant factor, not a rare exception. Tactics also became more flexible. Night fighters began to take on offensive missions. A new role emerged, the night intruder, a pilot flying deep into enemy territory to strike airfields, destroy supply barges, or target coastal traffic. For example, Squadron VMF-N 531 conducted regular night bombing missions against Japanese positions on Bougainville, hitting camps and supply depots. The enemy, deprived of nighttime air superiority, suddenly found itself vulnerable at all hours. By the end of 1944, the US Navy had built a comprehensive tactical system in which radar, fighters, fleet elements, and ground forces worked as a single integrated network. The Japanese tactic of night raids, once highly effective early in the war, ceased to yield real results. Every approach to an American fleet under the cover of darkness now carried the risk of early detection and destruction in the sky, long before any bomb could be dropped. The night sky had ceased to be a sanctuary. It had become a kill zone for any pilot of Imperial Japan.
The development of U.S. Navy night aviation during World War II would have been impossible without a technological revolution in radar. The greatest challenge in night air combat had always been the inability to visually detect the enemy. The key to overcoming this obstacle was the creation of compact, reliable, and sensitive airborne radar systems capable of automatically locating, tracking, and providing targeting data to the pilot. America's early experiments began in 1941, when the U.S. obtained a license from the United Kingdom for the AI Mk4 radar. Based on it, the SCR-540 radar was developed for use on twin-engine aircraft such as the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura, deployed by the Marine Corps. This radar was bulky and required a separate operator. Installed in the aircraft's nose, it could detect large targets up to 10 kilometers away. However, the Ventura's limited maneuverability and low operational ceiling made it a suboptimal interceptor. The breakthrough came with the arrival of a new generation of centimetric radars operating in the X-band, wavelength 3 centimeters. These were developed using British technology transferred through the Tizard mission, allowing the size of antennas to be drastically reduced without sacrificing accuracy. This led to the creation of compact radar sets like the AN/APS-4 and AN/APS-6, which became the backbone of U.S. Navy night fighter capability. Their key advantage was that they could fit into a pod mounted under the wing or on the outboard section of a single-seat fighter. The AN/APS-4 provided 360-degree coverage and could both detect and track targets, with data displayed on a circular scope in the cockpit. The Vought F4U-2 Corsair became the first single-seat carrier-based U.S. fighter adapted to carry such a radar. The modified version featured an AN/APS-4 pod mounted on the starboard wing, and one of the 6 machine guns was removed to offset the added weight. Despite the minor reduction in firepower, the aircraft retained excellent speed and range. The radar allowed pilots to detect enemy planes up to 7 kilometers away in darkness, enough to close in and strike. It could also identify ships, barges, and even clusters of ground targets, turning the F4U-2 into not just an interceptor, but also an effective night attack platform. The next stage came with the adaptation of the Navy's workhorse fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. This rugged plane, already famed as a Zero killer, received night fighter variants in 1943-44. The F-6F-3E, F-6F-3N, and later the F-6F-5N. Early versions used the AN/APS-4, while later ones incorporated the more advanced AN/APS-6, which was wing-mounted and fully integrated with the gun sight. The APS-6 offered high resistance to interference, simplified pilot controls, and greater compactness. The instrument panel was augmented with the radar scope displaying range and direction, allowing the pilot to lock on to targets based on GCI, ground-controlled intercept vectors, and seamlessly transition into the final intercept phase. Beyond radar, the night versions of the Hellcat were fitted with additional features for stealth and night navigation. Flame dampeners on the exhaust to reduce infrared signature, improved navigation instruments, red and infrared position lights, and upgraded radio communications. Armament was also adapted. Most F6F5Ns retained the standard 6.50 M2 Browning machine guns, but some versions replaced two guns with 20mm Hispano AM2 cannons, greatly offers.
Equally important were modifications of the TBF/TBM Avenger, torpedo bombers repurposed for night reconnaissance and strike roles. Outfitted with AM/APS-3 or APS-4 radars that acted as tactical scouts, detecting enemy groups, marking targets for fighters, or directly attacking barges and airfields. Aboard fleet carriers, they operated alongside F6, F5N squadrons, integrating offensive and interceptor functions. For long-range night interception and deep reconnaissance, the Navy also employed twin-engine aircraft. In the final phase of the war, it introduced the Grumman F-7F Tigercat and Douglas F-3D Skyknight, heavy night fighters with two-man crews, pilot and radar operator, large fuel capacity, and radars such as the AN/APS-6 or AN/APQ-35. However, they entered service only in the last months of the war and did not see significant combat in the Pacific. This diversity of aircraft and radar systems enabled the U.S. Navy to build a multi-layered night air control system. The use of both single-seat fighters with compact radars and heavier patrol aircraft with more powerful systems allowed for effective coverage of both close and distant airspace. Refining radar specifications, training pilots in radar usage, and honing target acquisition and coordination techniques with ground controllers, all of this transformed U.S. aviators into highly effective hunters of the night. Thus, the technological foundation of U.S. Navy night aviation became a decisive factor in the Pacific campaign. Through a successful combination of innovative radar, versatile aircraft, and well-conceived tactical systems, American pilots gained the ability to detect, pursue, and destroy enemy aircraft in total darkness, radically reshaping the balance of power in the night skies. Technology allowed the U.S. not only to command the day, but to conquer the night. Combat operations in the Pacific Theater from 1943 to 1945 became a proving ground for the intensive use of night aviation. From the outset, U.S. Navy radar-equipped night fighters demonstrated that they could radically alter the nature of nighttime warfare, turning darkness from the shield for the enemy into a space firmly under American control. Their role grew steadily, from basic fleet escort missions to becoming a full-fledged component of offensive operations. The first significant combat experience for U.S. Navy night aviation came during the Solomon Islands campaign, especially over Guadalcanal and Bougainville in late 1943. Squadrons such as VMFN 531, flying PV-1 Venturas and VFN 75 with F4U-2 Corsairs, began conducting night combat sorties. As Japanese aviation increasingly relied on nighttime raids by single bombers or small formations, American night fighters gradually refined coordination with ground-based radar and learned to intersect by instruments and began to down targets in total darkness.
A turning point occurred during the night of October 31 to November 1, 1943, when VFN 75 pilot Lieutenant Hugh O'Neill, guided by a GCI station, successfully shot down a G4M Betty bomber over Bougainville. This was one of the first confirmed night radar-assisted aerial victories in the Pacific. In the nights that followed, night fighters grew increasingly active, escorting the Bougainville landings, shooting down reconnaissance seaplanes, and conducting night raids on Japanese barges and ammunition depots. They had proven their effectiveness and necessity. As American forces advanced northwest in 1944 and launched operations to seize the Marshall and Mariana Islands, the concept of continuous radar coverage was deployed on a wide scale. New airfields were equipped with stationary and mobile radar systems, and night fighter squadrons were assigned to fleet carriers. For example, VMF-N 532, equipped with F4U-2s, was based on Kwajalein Atoll and patrolled the skies over Eniwetok, intercepting Japanese bombers. These missions marked the first successful night intersections at extended island outposts. Under the cover of such patrols, the Allies built airfields, prepared for new offensives, and gradually denied the Japanese Air Force even the nighttime freedom it had once enjoyed. The Philippine campaign in late 1944 became a true test for night fighters. With daytime air superiority slipping from its grasp, the Japanese began favoring night attacks, including suicide missions by kamikaze pilots. In response, the U.S. Navy launched the Big Blue Blanket strategy, a system of round-the-clock fleet air cover. Carrier groups now included full night aviation wings, F-6F-5N Hellcats with AN/APS-6 radars, long-range radar-equipped torpedo bombers, picket ships, and GCI stations. Night fighters patrolled the skies of Luzon, Mindanao, and Leyte, intercepting raids and destroying Japanese aircraft before they could reach the fleet. Despite the intensity of the fighting, the night fighters achieved impressive results, especially when integrated with ground radar and anti-aircraft artillery. In one night mission in December 1944, a group of F-6Fs shot down 6 enemy planes in a single sortie, preventing any breakthroughs to the carriers. Such results became routine. The Japanese could no longer rely on the cover of night as an advantage. The peak of U.S. night aviation came during the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. At Okinawa especially, Japanese night attacks became a form of desperate resistance. With daytime air superiority lost, the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to compensate with waves of kamikaze strikes at night. The defense against these assaults was a dense radar network centered on F-6F-5 night fighters deployed from both carriers and land bases. Each night, dozens of night fighters took to the skies, patrolling the area around the fleet and forward bases. Using data from radar picket destroyers and GCI stations, pilots intercepted enemy groups early and, working in pairs, scattered or destroyed them. During the Battle of Okinawa alone, U.S. Navy night fighters shot down nearly 80 enemy aircraft in darkness, according to the naval reports. These successes not only saved ships, but also demoralized Japanese pilots who no longer felt safe even at night.
A telling episode occurred aboard USS Saratoga in February 1945. During a night raid, a group of Japanese planes broke through cloud cover and attacked the carrier. Despite suffering damage, the ship's night fighters managed to shoot down most of the attacking force before they reached their target. After this, night air cover was reinforced, and similar breaches never happened again. It was during this period that U.S. Navy night aviation finally evolved from an experimental concept into a fully operational combat force. From the hesitant first patrols over Bougainville's jungles to the coordinated night operations off Okinawa, U.S. Navy night fighters underwent a rapid and intense evolution. They became the tool that enabled 24-hour air dominance, stripping Japanese forces of their last tactical advantage, darkness. In every major battle, night aviation played the role of defender, scout, and when needed, attacker. This contribution proved to be one of the decisive factors in securing U.S. victory in the Pacific. By the end of World War II, the skies over the Pacific had become a domain of total U.S. dominance. Whereas early in the conflict, Japanese aircraft could operate at night with little opposition, by 1944-1945, the situation had changed dramatically. A key factor in this shift was the systematic deployment of radar-equipped night fighters by the U.S. Navy,
which ultimately denied Japan the ability to use darkness as a tactical advantage. These radar interceptors became a cornerstone of America's strategy for 24-hour air control. Through a combination of land and ship-based radar, onboard detection systems, trained pilots, and refined coordination tactics, U.S. forces gained control of the skies both day and night. This shattered Japan's night warfare doctrine, which had relied on surprise, stealth, and psychological disruption under cover of darkness. Before the arrival of radar-equipped fighters, Japanese aircraft frequently launched night raids to bypass American air defenses and strike at supply depots, airfields, and anchored ships. U.S. troops, especially at forward island bases, suffered not only from direct damage, but also from the psychological toll of constant nocturnal threats. Aircraft like the G-4M Betty and Ki-21 Sally would appear overhead, drop a few bombs, and disrupt rest, sowing anxiety and fatigue among the ranks. But with the introduction of night squadrons equipped with radar, such as VMF-N531 and VF-N75, this began to change. As early as 1943 in the Solomons, American patrols were intercepting Japanese bombers before they could begin attack runs. Even the destruction of 1 or 2 bombers per night had a strategic impact, sending a clear message: the night was no longer safe. Japanese losses mounted, and the psychological effect of their raids diminished. Allied forces no longer felt helpless after sundown. By 1944, during the Marianas and Philippines campaigns, night fighters had become a permanent part of naval defense. They served not only as interceptors, but also as a deterrent. U.S. Navy commanders reported that the mere presence of radar-equipped fighters often caused the Japanese to cancel planned nighttime operations. In several cases, such as on Saipan and Guam, enemy activity surged when night squadrons were temporarily withdrawn, and vanished again upon their return. Even in small numbers, these units exerted a psychological dominance over the night skies.
Meanwhile, Japan failed to establish a viable night fighter system of its own. Attempts to deploy the J-1N1 Gecko with primitive radar were sporadic and largely ineffective. While the U.S. developed a layered network of ground stations, aircraft, command centers, and well-trained air crews, Japanese night fighters operated in isolation and lacked coordination, leaving them unable to contest American dominance in the dark. Equally important, U.S. night fighters weren't limited to defense. Units such as VMF-N531 conducted active night raids against enemy rear areas, attacking barges, airfields, and supply depots, disrupting logistics and demoralizing garrisons. Darkness had become a vulnerability for the Japanese, not a shield. Deprived of nighttime air cover, Japanese forces found themselves vulnerable even during hours they once relied on for rest and reorganization. The psychological impact was profound. U.S. troops no longer viewed nighttime as a period of vulnerability. Commanders could plan operations with round-the-clock air support in mind. Meanwhile, Japanese forces lost confidence, knowing that any move under cover of night might be swiftly detected and intercepted. In effect, the U.S. had achieved true 24/7 air superiority, not just physically, but mentally. By war's end, even near Japan's home islands, enemy aircraft rarely ventured into the night skies. American carriers approached Japanese shores protected by coordinated night fighter patrols. In the final months of the war, Japanese aviation had largely ceased conducting night sorties. Losses were too high and results too negligible. Thus, the deployment of radar-equipped night fighters played a strategically decisive role. It was not merely a technological milestone, but a fundamental shift in the very concept of air warfare. Japan lost its last tactical edge, surprise at night. The U.S., meanwhile, secured not just daylight, but complete day and night air supremacy, a factor that proved critical to victory in the Pacific, and one that foreshadowed new standards in post-war aviation.